Commander Zara Thorne's reputation preceded her into every room she entered, which explained why the repair bay of Station Kepler 9 had cleared out the moment her distinctive black armor appeared in the doorway. The Nexary officer moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given space, her violet eyes, the distinctive trait of her species, scanning the bay with tactical awareness that never fully disengaged. She chose a corner position that offered clear sight lines to all entrances, set down her plasma rifle and sidearm with practiced efficiency, and began the methodical process of weapon maintenance that had become both routine and ritual. The armor covering her shoulders and arms bore fresh scorch marks from the morning's engagement, testament to another successful mission that had saved civilian lives at the cost of 3 good soldiers under her command. The repair bay offered something Zara's quarters couldn't. Space to breathe without the weight of constant scrutiny. Here, surrounded by the familiar hum of diagnostic equipment and the occasional spark of plasma welding, she could exist without being Commander Thorne, the Silent Storm, the Nexary officer whose tactical brilliance was matched only by her legendary temper. She pulled a cleaning rod through her rifle's plasma chamber, the repetitive motion serving as meditation. 3 soldiers. Jenkins, barely 22, who joined the fleet to see the galaxy and instead saw only the inside of a pirate raider's torpedo bay. Martinez, a veteran engineer who'd survived a dozen campaigns only to die protecting civilians who would never know his name. And Okafor, whose dry humor had kept morale alive during the worst assignments. Their deaths weren't her fault, tactically, strategically, or morally. The engagement had been a complete success by every metric that mattered to Fleet Command. The civilian transport had escaped with all hands, the pirate raiders had been neutralized, and the shipping lanes were secure. But Zara knew the weight of command decisions that saved many by sacrificing few, and that weight never grew easier to carry. The repair bay's main door hissed open, and Zara's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm before she registered the unhurried footsteps of someone who belonged here. Chief Engineer Marcus Reed entered carrying a diagnostic tablet and wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested he was thinking about plasma conduit efficiency ratings rather than the legendary temper of the armored figure in the corner. Unlike the previous occupants, he didn't immediately reverse course upon noticing her presence. Instead, he nodded acknowledgement, the same brief gesture he'd give any fellow professional, and moved to a bank of atmospheric processors that apparently required his attention. Zara watched him work, waiting for the inevitable moment when he'd realize who she was and find urgent business elsewhere. Everyone knew the stories. Commander Thorne's dressing down of Admiral Hayes for suggesting civilian evacuation delays were acceptable losses. The incident with the supply officer who tried to shortchange her unit's equipment requisitions. The pirate captain who'd made the mistake of calling her species pretty but ineffective, and had learned that Nexary combat training emphasized precision over mercy. But Marcus continued his diagnostic work with steady competence, occasionally making small adjustments to the processor's calibration settings. His presence was neither intrusive nor deferential, simply professional acknowledgement that they were both here to do their jobs. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of weapon maintenance and engineering diagnostics. After 20 minutes, Zara realized she was waiting for him to speak, to ask questions, to acknowledge her reputation or her recent mission or the obvious fact that she was sitting alone in a repair bay cleaning weapons instead of filing reports like a proper officer. He didn't. Marcus finished his work on the atmospheric processors and moved to a plasma conduit junction that had been flagging intermittent efficiency warnings. His approach was methodical, unhurried, the kind of systematic problem-solving that Zara recognized and respected. When he needed a tool from his kit, he retrieved it without drama. When the plasma coupling required recalibration, he made the adjustment with practiced ease. For the first time in hours, Zara felt her shoulders relax slightly. The rigid military posture she maintained in public, spine straight, chin up, ready for any challenge, softened into something marginally less aggressive. She was still alert, still aware of her surroundings, but the constant vigilance that came with command responsibility felt less urgent here. Temperature regulation's been acting up all week, Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to her. Nothing critical, but the environmental systems are compensating by working harder than they should. It wasn't directed at Zara, didn't require a response, and somehow felt more genuine than most conversations she'd had in months. No acknowledgement of her rank, no careful navigation around her reputation, no questions about classified missions or tactical decisions. Just an engineer talking to himself about atmospheric processors while she cleaned weapons in companionable silence. Zara found herself listening to the rhythm of his work, the soft beep of diagnostic scans, the occasional hum of recalibrated equipment, the satisfied sound he made when a system returned to optimal efficiency. It was peaceful in a way she'd almost forgotten existed, like watching rain on a window during a quiet evening. When Marcus finished his maintenance routine and packed his equipment, Zara expected him to leave with the same practical efficiency he'd shown throughout his work. Instead, he paused near his toolkit and glanced at the environmental display. "Should be more comfortable in here now," he said, still not quite addressing her directly. "Coffee dispensing unit's still terrible, though. That's next week's project." He left without ceremony, and Zara realized she'd been holding her breath without knowing why. The repair bay felt different now, not empty, exactly, but expectant. As if the space had been calibrated for something other than solitude. She finished cleaning her rifle and began work on her sidearm, noting that the environmental systems were indeed running more smoothly. The temperature felt more balanced, the air circulation less noticeable, the kind of background comfort that good engineering provided without fanfare. For the first time since the morning's engagement, Zara exhaled properly, not the controlled breathing of combat readiness or the measured respiration of diplomatic necessity, but the kind of breath that let tension flow out with the air. Marcus Reed hadn't tried to comfort her, hadn't offered condolences for her lost soldiers, hadn't made any attempt to address the emotional weight she carried. He'd simply shared the space with professional competence and left it better than he'd found it. As Zara packed her weapons and prepared to return to her duties, she found herself hoping that the atmospheric processors would need attention again tomorrow. Marcus Reed had been a starship engineer long enough to develop theories about people, and his current theory was that Commander Thorne needed to be alone the way a plasma conduit needed to discharge excess energy, regularly, safely, and without interference from well-meaning technicians who thought they could fix everything with the right tools. He'd been timing his maintenance rounds to coincide with her presence in the repair bay for 3 days now, not from any deliberate plan but because the atmospheric processors seemed to require attention whenever she was sitting in the corner cleaning weapons with the methodical precision of someone working through complicated thoughts. Coincidence, he'd told himself the first day. Scheduled maintenance, he'd rationalized the second. By the third day, he'd admitted that he was deliberately sharing space with the most feared officer on the station because she looked like someone who needed not to be alone but couldn't ask for company. Marcus understood the distinction. 15 years of engineering in deep space had taught him the difference between solitude and isolation, between productive quiet and the kind of silence that ate people from the inside out. Commander Thorne wasn't seeking solitude, she was enduring isolation, and there was a difference that mattered. He entered the repair bay carrying his usual diagnostic equipment plus a thermal mug of coffee that actually came from his private stash rather than the station's dispensing units. The coffee was terrible regardless of source, but his was terrible in a familiar way that felt more like choice than circumstance. Commander Thorne was in her usual position, armor reflecting the bay's work lights as she field-stripped her sidearm with movements so practiced they seemed automatic. She glanced up at his entrance, the same brief acknowledgement she always gave, then returned to her work. Marcus had learned not to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. Instead, he began his inspection of the plasma conduit junction that had been showing minor fluctuations in efficiency ratings. The work was genuine, everything on a space station required constant maintenance, but he'd reorganized his schedule to address the bay's systems during what had become their shared quiet time. The companionable silence that developed felt different from ordinary quiet. It had weight, substance, the kind of pregnant calm that came from two people choosing to exist in the same space without demands or expectations. Marcus worked through his diagnostic checklist while Commander Thorne cleaned her weapons, and somehow their separate activities created a harmony that neither acknowledged but both depended on. Plasma flows running smoother than spec, Marcus commented, more to himself than to her. Sometimes systems just need to be left alone to find their optimal settings. He wasn't sure if she caught the implied philosophy, but her shoulders seemed marginally less rigid as she reassembled her sidearm. On the 5th day, Marcus found an extra cup of coffee sitting near his toolkit when he arrived. It was station standard terrible coffee, but it was hot and positioned exactly where he'd be most likely to notice it. Commander Thorne gave no indication she'd placed it there, but her armor was already set aside and her weapons laid out for maintenance, suggesting she'd been in the bay longer than usual. Marcus accepted the coffee without comment, the same way he'd accepted her presence, as a fact requiring no analysis or acknowledgement beyond quiet appreciation. On the 7th day, he left a technical manual on plasma rifle maintenance sitting where she'd be likely to see it. The manual was from his personal collection, marked with marginalia from years of practical application, and represented knowledge that wasn't available in standard military documentation. The manual was gone the next day, and in its place was a small data chip labeled Necessary Combat Engineering Techniques, Practical Applications. Marcus plugged it into his diagnostic tablet during lunch and discovered detailed schematics for atmospheric processor modifications that could improve efficiency by 12% under combat conditions. They were trading expertise, he realized. Not gifts, exactly, but professional resources exchanged between colleagues who respected each other's competence. It felt more meaningful than gift-giving because it acknowledged who they actually were rather than who they might wish to be. The repair bay began to feel different as their routine solidified. Other personnel still gave Commander Thorne space, but the atmosphere changed from fearful avoidance to respectful acknowledgement of a sanctuary. When Lieutenant Parks needed to check the bay's environmental systems, he spoke in hushed tones and worked efficiently. When Technician Wu came to replace a faulty diagnostic sensor, she moved with the careful consideration of someone entering a library rather than a workspace. Marcus realized they'd inadvertently created something rare on a military station, a place where rank mattered less than mutual respect, where the legendary Silent Storm could exist as simply Zara, even if neither of them used her first name. Your plasma coupling's running 0.2% below optimal, Commander Thorne said quietly on the 10th day, the first time she'd spoken directly to him since their arrangement began. Marcus looked up from the atmospheric processor he'd been calibrating. Which coupling? Primary rifle, junction 7. Not enough to affect performance, but thought you should know. It was such a perfectly practical observation, delivered with the same matter-of-fact competence he brought to his engineering work. Marcus appreciated that she'd framed it as information sharing rather than a request for help. I can take a look at that, he offered. Been meaning to run efficiency diagnostics on the weapons maintenance equipment anyway. I'd appreciate that, she replied, and something in her tone suggested the appreciation extended beyond plasma coupling maintenance. When Marcus finished his work and began packing his equipment, he noticed Commander Thorne had completed her weapon maintenance but wasn't immediately preparing to leave. Instead, she was sitting with her back against the bay's wall, armor set aside, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. Temperature regulations working better, she observed. Good engineering tends to be invisible, Marcus replied. System works properly, nobody notices. System fails, everybody has opinions. Command's similar, she said, and it might have been the most personal thing she'd ever shared. Make the right tactical decisions, nobody questions your methods. Make the wrong ones, everybody becomes a strategic expert. Marcus understood she was talking about more than abstract command theory, but he didn't push for details. Instead, he offered the same practical observation he'd give any colleague: hard to make perfect decisions with imperfect information. Best you can do is use good data and accept the consequences. Commander Thorne was quiet for a moment, processing this with the same careful attention she gave everything else. Good data, she repeated, as if testing the concept. That's rarer than it should be. Most things worth having are, Marcus agreed. As he left the repair bay that day, Marcus realized their shared silence had evolved into something more complex. Not just companionable quiet, but communicative understanding. They were beginning to trust each other with small pieces of who they actually were beneath their professional roles. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned but both of them needed. The emergency klaxon that woke Station Kepler 9 at 0347 hours carried the specific pattern that meant civilian vessels under attack, immediate military response required, all available combat personnel report for deployment briefing. Marcus recognized the sound from 15 years of station assignments, but he'd never seen how it transformed Commander Thorne. By the time he'd pulled on his uniform and made it to the corridor, she was already moving toward the deployment bay with the fluid speed of someone whose nervous system had shifted into combat mode. Her armor was pristine black perfection, every system optimized, every weapon checked and ready. The relaxed figure from the repair bay had been replaced by something that looked like a weapon given human form. But Marcus caught the detail others missed. The almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as she adjusted her helmet's heads-up display, the way her breathing was just slightly too controlled, the microscopic tension around her violet eyes that suggested she was preparing to make the kind of decisions that would haunt her later. 3 civilian colony ships had come under coordinated attack from organized pirate raiders, the deployment briefing revealed. Standard protocol called for immediate intervention to prevent civilian casualties, with secondary objectives including neutralization of hostile forces and securing of shipping lanes. Commander Thorne would lead the tactical response aboard the destroyer Meridian, with a full complement of Marines and fighter support. Marcus watched her receive her orders with perfect military composure, but he'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated internal struggle. Her acknowledgement of the mission parameters was textbook professional, but her fingers tapped against her armor plating in a pattern he recognized as someone working through complex calculations that involved more than tactical considerations. After the briefing, as personnel dispersed to their deployment stations, Marcus found himself following Commander Thorne back toward the repair bay. Not stalking, not intruding, but somehow needing to see her one more time before she left for whatever impossible decisions awaited her in deep space. She was standing in their usual corner, checking her rifle's plasma coupling with movements that seemed less methodical than usual. The weapon was already in perfect condition. Marcus had verified its efficiency himself 2 days earlier, but she was running diagnostics anyway. "Marcus," she said without looking up, the first time she'd used his name. "Commander. The plasma coupling on your atmospheric processor 7 is running 0.3% below optimal efficiency. Won't affect environmental controls, but thought you should know." It was such a perfect mirror of their previous technical exchanges that Marcus almost smiled. Even preparing for combat deployment, she was maintaining their pattern of practical information sharing. "I'll take a look at that while you're gone," he promised. "Good." She finished her weapons check and sealed her rifle into its magnetic holster with practiced precision. "The coffee situation in this bay remains unacceptable. I'll work on improving that too." Commander Thorne turned to face him directly, and Marcus saw something in her violet eyes that he'd never seen before, not vulnerability exactly, but acknowledgement of connection. Recognition that their shared silence had become something worth preserving. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone choosing words carefully, "thank you for sitting with me." "Thank you for letting me," he replied, meaning it more than either of them was prepared to analyze. She nodded once, the same brief gesture she'd given him that first day, but now it felt like a promise rather than mere acknowledgement. Then she was gone, moving toward the deployment bay with the controlled lethality that had earned her reputation as the Silent Storm. Marcus remained in the repair bay for several minutes after her departure, surrounded by the evidence of their shared routine, the atmospheric processors running at optimal efficiency, the plasma conduits calibrated to perfection, the corner where Commander Thorne had found space to exist as something other than a weapon. The station felt different with her gone. Not empty, exactly, but unbalanced. As if a crucial system had been temporarily taken offline for essential maintenance. Marcus threw himself into his work with unusual intensity, upgrading environmental systems that didn't need upgrading, optimizing equipment that was already running efficiently, and completely rebuilding the repair bay's coffee dispensing unit using components from his personal supplies and some creative engineering that definitely wasn't covered by standard maintenance protocols. 3 weeks. That's how long the deployment was scheduled to last, assuming everything went according to plan. Marcus had been in the fleet long enough to know that tactical operations rarely followed their initial timelines, but he found himself counting days anyway. He missed their conversations, he realized, the brief exchanges of technical information that had evolved into something approaching friendship. He missed the weight of shared silence, the companionable presence of someone who understood that not everything needed to be explained or analyzed. Most of all, he missed knowing that Commander Thorne had a place where she could set aside her armor and simply breathe. The repair bay felt too large with only one person in it, too quiet without the soft sounds of weapon maintenance providing counterpoint to his engineering work. Marcus began leaving extra coffee in her usual spot, maintaining the routine even though she wasn't there to appreciate it. On day 18, news came back through fleet communications that the deployment had been successful, all 3 colony ships evacuated safely, pirate raiders neutralized, shipping lanes secured. Standard military language that revealed nothing about the human cost of tactical decisions or the weight carried by officers who made impossible choices in impossible situations. Marcus increased his coffee stockpile and made sure the atmospheric processors were running at peak efficiency. Commander Thorne would need her sanctuary when she returned, and he intended to ensure it was ready for her. The repair bay had become more than a workspace during her absence, it had become a promise. A commitment to maintaining space for someone who needed not to be alone but couldn't ask for company. Marcus understood that some relationships were built on grand gestures and dramatic declarations, but theirs was constructed from smaller materials, shared silence, technical competence, and the kind of trust that developed when 2 people chose to exist in each other's presence without demands or expectations. He was looking forward to continuing that construction when she came home. 21 days after deployment, Commander Zara Thorne returned to Station Kepler 9 with fresh scorch marks on her armor and new weight in her violet eyes. The mission had been classified as a complete success by fleet standards, all civilian lives saved, hostile forces neutralized, strategic objectives achieved. But Marcus had learned to read the spaces between official reports, and he knew that tactical success often came with personal costs that didn't appear in after-action summaries. He was in the repair bay when she arrived, not by coincidence but by deliberate choice. The atmospheric processors were running at optimal efficiency, the plasma conduits were calibrated to perfection, and the coffee dispensing unit had been completely rebuilt using components that definitely hadn't come from standard station supplies. Commander Thorne entered the bay moving with the same fluid precision he remembered, but something in her posture suggested exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. She paused in the doorway, taking in the familiar space as if confirming it still existed, then moved to her usual corner with obvious relief. Atmospheric Processor 7 is running smoothly, she observed, settling into position with her weapons maintenance kit. Good engineering tends to be persistent, Marcus replied, continuing his diagnostic work on a plasma coupling that was already functioning perfectly. Coffee situation has been addressed. He nodded toward the rebuilt dispensing unit, and Zara followed his gaze with something that might have been appreciation. The unit now produced coffee that qualified as merely adequate rather than actively hostile to human consumption, which represented a significant improvement by station standards. That's above and beyond standard maintenance protocols, she noted. Sometimes systems need more than standard protocols, Marcus said, and they both understood he wasn't talking about coffee machines. They fell into their familiar rhythm, parallel work, companionable silence, the kind of shared space that didn't require conversation but welcomed it when words felt necessary. But the silence between them now carried different weight, deeper understanding, the accumulated trust of weeks spent in each other's presence. Deployment went well, Zara said after an hour of quiet weapon maintenance. So I heard. All objectives achieved, minimal casualties, textbook tactical execution. Textbook, she agreed, but her tone suggested that textbook solutions sometimes came with costs that didn't appear in the official metrics. Marcus understood she was offering him a piece of something larger, a glimpse into the weight that came with command decisions made under impossible circumstances. He also understood that she didn't need him to fix it, analyze it, or make it better with engineering solutions. She just needed someone to acknowledge that the weight existed. Hard to make perfect decisions with imperfect information, he said, echoing their earlier conversation. Best you can do is use good data and accept the consequences. Good data, Zara repeated, and this time it sounded like something she was choosing to believe rather than something she was testing. That's what I told myself when I ordered the Marines to breach the pirate command ship instead of waiting for backup. Marcus continued his diagnostic work, letting her words exist in the space between them without immediate response. Sometimes people needed to speak their thoughts aloud before they could process them internally. 17 pirates surrendered when they realized we'd taken their command structure, she continued. 43 more died fighting in corridors that could have been cleared with less aggressive tactics if I'd been willing to risk civilian casualties while waiting for additional support. But you weren't, Marcus observed. Willing to risk civilian casualties? No. I wasn't. Zara finished cleaning her rifle and began reassembling it with movements that had become automatic. So 43 pirates died quickly instead of possibly surviving longer, and 3,000 civilians lived who might have died slowly. Marcus recognized the mathematics of command, the impossible calculations that weighed certain costs against probable benefits, immediate losses against potential catastrophes. It was similar to engineering decisions about system redundancy and acceptable failure rates, but with human lives instead of plasma conduits. Sounds like you used the best available data to minimize total casualties, he said. That's what the after-action report concluded, Zara agreed. Textbook tactical decision-making, optimal resource allocation, acceptable losses within mission parameters. But 43 beings stopped existing because I decided their lives were worth less than 3,000 others. She sealed her rifle into its holster and leaned back against the bay wall. Mathematically correct, tactically sound, morally defensible. And I'll carry their faces for the rest of my life. Marcus set down his diagnostic tools and looked at her directly, not at her armor or her rank insignia, but at Zara herself. That weight you're carrying? That's not a flaw in your decision-making process. That's proof it's working correctly. She met his gaze with violet eyes that held too much experience. Explain. Anyone who could make those decisions without feeling their weight shouldn't be trusted with that kind of responsibility. The fact that you carry the cost means you understand what you're spending when you spend it. Zara was quiet for several minutes, processing this perspective with the same careful attention she gave everything else. You really believe that? I've seen officers who treat casualties like statistics and engineers who treat system failures like mere inconveniences, Marcus said. The best leaders in both fields are the ones who never forget that every decision has consequences for actual people. Something shifted in Zara's expression, not resolution exactly, but acceptance. The kind of peace that came from having someone understand not just what you'd done, but why the doing of it mattered. Marcus, she said, and her voice carried warmth he'd never heard before, thank you. For what? For sitting with me when I needed not to be alone. For sharing silence when I couldn't find words. For understanding that sometimes the best help is just presence. Marcus smiled, the first completely genuine expression he'd shown since her deployment began. Thank you for trusting me with the space beside you. Zara removed her helmet for the first time in his presence, revealing silver hair that caught the repair bay's work lights and made her look less like a weapon and more like a person who happened to be very good at tactical decision-making. She set the helmet aside with deliberate care and exhaled, not the controlled breathing of combat readiness, but the kind of breath that let tension flow out with the air. The coffee really is better, she observed, testing the rebuilt dispensing unit. Engineering solutions to practical problems, Marcus replied. Though I should probably mention that I may have violated several procurement regulations to source the components. I'll make sure not to notice that in any official capacity, Zara said, and her smile transformed her entire face. Plausible deniability is an important command skill. As they continued their parallel work, Marcus maintaining systems that didn't need maintenance, Zara organizing equipment that was already perfectly organized, the repair bay settled into a comfortable routine that felt more like home than sanctuary. They spoke occasionally now, brief observations about technical challenges or dry comments about the inadequacies of military bureaucracy. But the silence between words remained companionable, full of understanding that didn't require constant verification. "Marcus," Zara said as she prepared to leave for the evening, "I want you to know something." "What's that?" "The deployment was easier because I knew this place would be here when I got back." "Knew you'd be here, maintaining the systems and improving the coffee and not asking questions I wasn't ready to answer." Marcus understood she was talking about more than atmospheric processors and caffeine delivery mechanisms. "It'll always be here, Zara. As long as you need it." She smiled. The kind of genuine expression that made him understand why the Nexari were considered one of the most beautiful species in the galaxy, and gathered her equipment with practiced efficiency. "See you tomorrow, Marcus." "See you tomorrow, Commander." As she left the repair bay, Marcus realized their relationship had evolved into something he'd never quite experienced before, a friendship built on mutual respect, shared silence, and the kind of trust that developed when two people chose to exist in each other's presence without demands or expectations. It was built on the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you could do for another person was simply to sit beside them when no one else would, offering not solutions or comfort but presence itself. And in a universe full of noise, demands, and constant motion, that kind of quiet companionship felt like the most valuable thing either of them possessed.